So just to kind of recap a little bit, the point of the Sermon on the Mount is to highlight the tension that exists between what I am and what I need to be, or what I ought to be. And it's this tension between what I actually am and what I ought to be, or what I need to be. It's this tension that causes worry and depression and guilt and anger and anxiety and so on. And we feel that tension every day, the tension between what we are and what we ought to be. I read a while back, I got a note from a young mom who said this to me: "Deep down, I know I should be perfect and I'm not. I feel it when someone comes into my house unannounced and there's a mess in every corner. I know it when my children misbehave in public and I just want to hide. I can tell it when that empty feeling arises after I've spoken in haste, said too much, or raised my voice. There's this feeling in my stomach that I just can't shake when I know I've missed the mark of perfection." This is a tension that we all feel, consciously or unconsciously, on a regular basis. The tension between what we know we should be, what we know we ought to be, what we believe we need to be, and what we actually are. That is the reason why we typically Photoshop our lives. We put our best foot forward. We try to conceal those parts of us that we think would cause people to run away, because we are desperately fearful of people knowing who we really are at our core, because if they did, they may not love us anymore. They may reject us. And so we feel this tension in a variety of different ways, this tension between what we are in reality and what we know we ought to be. And there are two ways to deal with this tension. The first is to convince yourself that you can become what you need to be with hard work. Okay, that's the first way to deal with it. The second way is to acknowledge your helplessness and cry for mercy. Only two options. When we feel that tension, we can either convince ourselves that we can become what we need to be with hard work, or we simply acknowledge our helplessness and cry for help, cry for mercy. Option one requires you to lower the demand, to set the bar near to the ground, to sort of make the demands doable. Maybe I'm not a perfect parent, or maybe I'm not a great parent, but at least I'm not a bad one. We lower the bar. Maybe I don't love my wife the way I should, but I'm really not mean to her. We lower the bar. We don't think that perfection is the goal. We think that just getting a little bit better every day, that's the goal. Option two refuses to lower the demand. It allows the requirements to be all that God intends them to be, but finding freedom in one who came to do for us what we could never do for ourselves. So those are the two options. Option one, we convince ourselves that with little grit and hard work, we can do it. We can jump the bar. Option two is to acknowledge that we can't do it. We acknowledge our helplessness and we cry for mercy. Well, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus shows our helplessness. That's what the purpose of this sermon is. It's Jesus showing us our helplessness before the devastation of divine expectation. And that, believe it or not, is what creates the space for God's amazing grace and the freedom that it produces. Those who revel in grace are those who have a high view of the law, because they realize that they're forced to say, I can't do it. Unless help comes, I'm ruined. Okay, so when we take God's law for what it's worth at face value, we realize we can never make it on our own. To the degree that we think we can basically make it on our own, we'll start saying stuff like, can't we move on now? I mean, have we not heard enough about this grace thing? Can't you start just telling us what to do? Give us lifestyle instructions. I mean, let's move on. Yes, grace, yada, yada, yada. But let's move on now. Let's get to my part. Let's get to what I need to do. But you see, only an inflexible picture of what God demands is able to penetrate the depth of our need and convince us that we never, ever outgrow our need for grace. That grace never, ever gets overplayed. The only people who believe that grace is overplayed, that we talk about it too much, are the people who have lowered the bar. Because if you lower the bar, you don't need grace. If you lower the bar, if you make the demands doable, well, then you can do it on your own. You don't need to hear about grace. You just need an instruction manual on what to do. And if we simply give you an instruction manual, then you can set out to do what needs to be done. And so those are the people throughout the course of my career, really, who have sort of pushed back on the idea of grace. People who have a higher view of what they can accomplish. People who have a higher view of who they are. And they go, okay, enough talk about what God has done for me. I want to start talking about what I need to do. I was having a conversation at Fallen and Free. And this person said to me, and I've gotten this question a lot from people, does someone have to crash and burn like you did or really mess up badly to understand grace? Like, what if we haven't blown it big time like you, Tullian? I mean, what if we haven't screwed up our lives royally? I mean, I know you talk a lot about grace, and that makes sense because you really tanked. But I haven't tanked. My life has been pretty orderly for the most part. I haven't been perfect, but I've kind of kept my life between the lines. Do we really have to blow it big in order to understand grace? And I say, no. I mean, it helps, but no. And to be honest with you, the people who have blown it big are the people who seem to revel in grace the most. But you don't have to blow it big to revel in grace. You don't have to really mess up your lives and hurt people around you and screw things up in order for you to appreciate the grandeur of grace. You don't have to. You see, all you need to do is to take God's law at face value. And if you take God's law at face value, you'll recognize your desperation and need to such a degree that grace becomes your only hope and your only lifeline. So I said to this person, well, no, you don't have to blow it big, but if you think that you haven't blown it big, at least inside, keep looking. That's what Jesus is intending to do. He's talking to religious people who have, for the most part, kept their lives nice and clean on the outside, but what he's getting ready to do is expose the fact that they are just as bad on the inside as anybody else. Just as desperate and needy on the inside as everybody else. My friend Steve Brown, who was here for Fallen and Free. I don't know if you guys, for those of you who are here, if you haven't, the video's up, the audio's up. You need to watch it. Steve is a dear friend of mine. He's going to be back here in July to preach for me. Isn't that going to be amazing? But he said a while back, as you get older, you begin to realize that if God's grace isn't everything, then you don't have a chance. It reminds me of that portion in John 8 where the religious leaders drag the woman caught in adultery to Jesus to try to trick him. See, the law of Moses says that, if someone's caught in adultery, you need to stone them. What do you say? And what they're doing is they're trying to bait Jesus into sort of saying something that he shouldn't say. And Jesus, wise as he was, he's still alive, wise as he is, said, okay, well, you without sin cast the first stone. And there's this little sort of almost throwaway line right there that I didn't really notice until about 10 years ago. It says, and beginning with the oldest, they dropped their stones and walked away. And I didn't really know what that meant when I first read it and passed over it for many, many years. But then it dawned on me as I started to get older. When you get older, you start sort of your idealism begins to fade and realism sets in and you begin to realize, you know what? I'm really not that much better than everybody else, no matter how hard I try to make myself out to be. And so Steve's words are right. As you get older, you begin to realize that if God's grace isn't everything, then you don't have a chance. You see, the way of God's grace becomes indispensable when we see that the way of God's law is inflexible. Okay, I'll say that again, because that's really kind of the thesis of this message. That the way of God's grace becomes indispensable when we see that the way of God's law is inflexible. So in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus wants to set us free by showing us our need for a goodness and rightness that we can never attain on our own, ever. an impossible righteousness that's always out of our reach, always. The purpose of the Sermon on the Mount is to demolish all notions that we can meet God's requirements on our own. That's what the purpose of the Sermon on the Mount is. So the Sermon on the Mount is not a goal to reach. That's oftentimes the way it's taught, the way it's preached. But the Sermon on the Mount is sort of an ethics manual for Christians. That this is the way we ought to live. And because we are told this is the way we ought to live, we must be able to do it. But the Sermon on the Mount is not a goal to reach. It's a merciful wall that we crash into so that we finally cry out, I can't do it. That's what it's intended to do. The Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' sermon on the 10 Commandments. And the 10 Commandments were given to us primarily to show us that we can't make it on our own. There's no way we can do this. There's no way that we can just sort of, muster up the courage and the willpower to just pull it off. We can't do it no matter how hard we try. It's a wall that we crash into so that we finally cry out, I can't do it. So the Sermon on the Mount does us a huge favor by exposing us to ourselves, by exposing our limitations, by exposing our deficiencies, by exposing our weaknesses and our inabilities. A few weeks ago, the last time I preached on this, I showed that there's no getting around God's demand. No getting around it. There's no exit doors. There's no getting around it. It has to be fulfilled. And what's required, Jesus said, is a righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees. Now that's discouraging because those guys really did it well. I mean, as far as keeping God's law, there was no one on planet Earth that did it better than those guys. And so as the other people, the non-scribes and the non-Pharisees, the common folk are listening to this demand that the righteousness that God requires must exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees, these people are like, well, if it has to exceed, I can't even do what they do. If it has to exceed what they do, I'm in big trouble, big trouble. But Jesus also wanted to show the religious leaders that all of the righteousness that they were able to sort of accumulate and achieve is not what God requires. That's setting the bar far too low. Well, this week's passage fills in the content of that righteousness. What is it? What is that righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees? What is it essentially that God requires, that he demands? Well, chapter 5, verse 20 raises the question, what is required to enter the kingdom of heaven? And chapter 5, verses 21 through 48 gives the answer. And then chapter 5, verses 21 to 47 is kind of a preface to chapter 5, verse 48, which states the demand in its most radical form. He concludes this section by saying, basically what I'm saying is, be perfect as God is perfect. So he gives all of these things that we need to do, and then he concludes by saying, let me just sum up everything I just said by simply saying this. You need to be perfect. You don't need to be good. You don't need to be daily improving. You need to be perfect. Perfection is the only thing God accepts. Well, once we hear that, it is a death blow. It's a death blow to all of us. It is a merciful impasse because we know we're not perfect. In fact, we have so normalized the concept of imperfection that we don't see it for sort of the catastrophe that it is. If the only thing God accepts is perfection, and I don't think there's a person in this room that would think that they're perfect. So if that's the requirement, if perfection is the requirement, then we're all screwed. Then what do we do? That's the point of desperation that this sermon, that this message that Jesus is delivering is intended to get us to. This section that I read just a few minutes ago is traditionally called the antithesis. Because when Jesus says, you've heard it said, but I say to you, some have claimed that Jesus is pitting new sayings against old sayings. Like, this is the way that it used to be, no longer. This is the way it now is. Okay, so people have read this and thought Jesus is distancing himself from the Old Testament, from the law of Moses. And he's saying that's the way it was back then. But now it's a new day, and this is the way it is now. And so people have referred to this section as the antithesis. But that's not what Jesus is doing here. He's showing that God's law extends beyond outer behavior to what's in the heart. so that people hear God's demand in an intensified way. Jesus shows that the law's demands extend to what goes on inside of us. It's not just that we must be absolutely pure on the outside, perfect on the outside, behaviorally, but we also have to be absolutely pure in our feelings, in our motives. So he exposes that it's not just external conformity or behavior modification that is required here. It's not just our actions that have to be pure. Our feelings, our motivations, our thoughts have to be absolutely pure too. You know, human defense systems, and we all have them, live by the thought-action distinction. This is what I mean by that. Therapists are always telling patients that it's okay to have the thought so long as it doesn't lead to the act. Okay, I know you're thinking this way, I know you're feeling this way, and that's okay, but don't act on it. That's when it gets really bad. Wanting to kill someone is one thing, but actually killing someone is another matter altogether. Now, we know that's true, okay? If I want to kill someone, I don't go to prison. If I do kill someone, I do go to prison. So the horizontal consequences are obviously very different. But while it's true in the eyes of the state that wanting to kill someone is one thing and actually killing someone is another matter, while that's true in the eyes of the state, it's not true in the eyes of God. And that's what he makes clear here. Jesus insists here that anger and murder are equally liable to judgment. Equally. He shows that in God's economy, there is an equality between intention and action, thought and deed. When he addresses lust and adultery, he goes even deeper. Not only are thoughts and actions equally liable to judgment, they're actually the same thing. Lust is adultery, he says. The impulse inside is the sin. So these two pictures that I read just a few minutes ago, anger, adultery, these two pictures demolish the thought-deed distinction that prevents us from seeing how desperately we need Jesus. Because as long as we maintain that distinction, we don't feel as desperate. In fact, we might even feel proud of ourselves. Well, I wanted to kill that person, but I didn't. Aren't I good? You know, I really wanted to hold a grudge against that person. But I didn't. Isn't that good? I really wanted to commit adultery. I really wanted to. I really wanted her. I really wanted him. But I restrained myself and didn't do it. Aren't I righteous? See, the reason it's so important, this is so important, is because many Christians think they're pulling it off when they obey, even when they don't want to. We're proud of ourselves when we do that. Where did we get the idea that if we do what God tells us to do, even though our hearts are far from him, that it's something to be proud of, something admirable, something praiseworthy? Now listen, don't get me wrong. We should do the right thing even when we don't feel like it. Okay, I'm not saying only do the right thing when you feel like doing it. You'll never do the right thing if you wait. Okay, so I'm not saying only do the right thing when you feel like it. But let's not make the common mistake of proudly equating that with the righteousness that God requires. I'm not sure where we got the idea. In fact, in a lot of Christian circles that I've been a part of, there is a pride that develops when somebody basically announces that even though they wanted to do this bad thing, they didn't do it. Their heart wanted it, but they restrained themselves and disciplined themselves not to do it. And as a result, we think, well, God must be very proud of me for that. But doing the right thing with the wrong heart actually reveals deep unrighteousness, not devout righteousness. Okay, so doing the right thing with the wrong heart shows the disconnect between what we ought to do and what we want to do. And then the rest of this passage just keeps piling on. I didn't read it because it was so long, but he talks about divorce. No divorce without a biblical warrant, or you're guilty of adultery. Okay, so if your marriage ended just because you guys didn't like each other anymore, but there was no abandonment or abuse or adultery, then you're guilty of adultery too. Okay, he goes on and just sort of lays it on thick. You have to always tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. No revenge or vengeful thoughts. And you can't just love your neighbors, but you also have to love your enemies. Love them. And you can't just love them on the outside, you have to want to love them on the inside. I mean, he really lays it on thick here. He's really laying down the law in a way that is intended to expose us and intended to expose our need for him. And then after all this, as I mentioned, the gracious death blow, the merciful wall, the glorious impossibility. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Now, Jesus' intent there in finishing this section with those words is to ensure that we are all flat on our face or flat on our back, where we realize, you know what, as good as I think I am, as good as other people may believe me to be, I'm really a mess. I have fallen so far short of God's requirement that I am no cleaner than the dirtiest person I know. As I've said before, my friend Jean LaRue saying, if you're not the worst sinner you know, you don't know yourself very well. That's what this is intended to do. Now, lest we think that Jesus is mean and cruel and he just wants us to feel bad and he wants us to feel really low, there is a purpose behind this that is intended to give us life and freedom. We will never, as I mentioned before, we will never see and appreciate the amazing grace of God the way that we ought until we realize how badly we need it. That's what real spiritual growth is. It's a growing awareness of our need for grace. And we'll never grow in our awareness of our need for grace if we think we're pretty good, if we think we're pretty strong, when we realize that before God, we may be pretty good and pretty strong compared to the person sitting to the left of us or the person sitting to the right of us or our neighbor or the guy that we work with or whatever. But that's really not the standard. The person sitting next to you is not the standard. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. That's the standard. That death blow, that be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect, that death blow is gracious because it has as its goal our resurrection to a new and free life filled with light and laughter. It's intended to kill us. That death blow is intended to kill us. It's intended to put to death this foolish notion that we are self-sufficient, this delusional and enslaving notion that we are self-sufficient. That is an enslaving notion. We're taught that if you can believe you're self-sufficient and you can accomplish anything, that will empower you. Well, that may temporarily inspire you, but the older you get and the more you fail and the more you fall and the more you realize who you really are, that just becomes a farce. I mean, a religion of human goodness falls flat in the face of personal catastrophe. Whether that personal catastrophe is acted out or if it's just kept inside. When you stop believing that you're capable on your own, some really good things happen. Some really life-giving things happen. Number one, you don't take yourself too seriously anymore. You know, one of the things that my grandparents, my grandmother in particular, taught us from the time I can remember was to take God seriously, but to never take yourself too seriously. And that the more seriously you take God, the less seriously you'll take yourself. And so one of the things that this does for you is it helps you not take yourself so seriously. And the other thing it does is it helps you go easier on people when they screw up. You become more empathetic. You become more gracious. You become more forgiving. When you stop having a high anthropology, that we are big, capable people who are capable of accomplishing big things. When your anthropology is lowered and you realize, I'm not as strong as I thought I was. And you know what? My wife isn't either, or my husband isn't either, or my parents aren't either. And, you know, they're humans. You know, I was telling Jenna this week, my parents got divorced after 41 years of marriage. 41 years. I mean, you think by that time, like, just hang on, dude, you know? I mean, come on. Right? How much better are you going to be able to go out there and get, okay? Anyway, my mom would be open and willing to tell that story now. But after 41 years of marriage, my parents got divorced. I was in my early 30s at the time, and I was devastated. Devastated. I mean, I was angry at my mom. I was angry at my dad. I was just devastated. How could you? And I sought counsel from a family friend named Larry Crabb, and one of the things he said to me that was so helpful, I remember where I was pacing in my garage back and forth, talking to him on the phone. And I was like, Larry, how do I handle this? And he said, Tullian, all your parents have done in this is to show you that they were never the gods you thought they were. I think that that's very true. You know, we get so disappointed with one another when we screw up. And one of the things that disappointment exposes is the fact that we expected this person to be better than they were, stronger than they were, more capable than they were. But when you realize, when you understand that the demand is for perfection, and that nobody on earth meets that demand, it makes you a little bit more gracious with one another. That the people around you, the people sitting next to you, the people in your life, they're just as human and screwed up as you are. They're just as afraid as you are. They are broken people living in a broken world with other broken people just like you are. They're human. They're human. You see, Christianity is not good advice for people who try hard. It's good news for people who finally give up. That's what it is. It's not always treated that way. Oftentimes, Christianity is treated as good advice for people who try hard, for the moral people who keep the rules and who keep keeping the rules. But in reality, it's good news for people who finally give up. Let me give you a few what-ifs. These are things I've been thinking about a lot over the last month or so. But let me give you a few what-ifs. What if getting better isn't about becoming a better person, whatever that means anyway? Okay, what if getting better isn't about becoming a better person, whatever that means? What if getting better is a growing awareness of our need for help? What if that's what it means to get better? A growing awareness of our need for help, a deepening recognition of how delusional and enslaving self-sufficiency is. What if that's what getting better is all about? What if true growth isn't about the heights we should attain, but about acknowledging the depth of our need? What if that's what real growth is? It's not about the heights that we should attain and the goals we should reach, but it's about acknowledging the depth of our need. When I'm around people like that, people who recognize the depth of their need, they're easy to be around. They're softer. They're more empathetic. They're more gracious. Those are the kinds of non-blinking friends I want to confess my sins to. Because I know they're not going to look at me sideways like, oh my gosh, okay, I had no idea. I mean, these are the kinds of people that you want in your life. The kinds of people, those are the mature kinds of people that have ministered to me in the most potent and powerful ways. The people who know themselves well enough to know that they're no better than whatever it is you're telling them. They may not be guilty of the same thing that you're confessing, but they know their own hearts. They know their own need. They know their own desperation, and so they listen. They don't judge. We talk so much about how terrible it is to be around judgmental people, but what we don't often think about is how judgmentalism is connected to a low view of the law. Because if you have a low view of God's requirements and you think you're pulling it off, you're going to look down on everybody that you don't think is pulling it off. But I'm doing it, why can't you do it? I mean, I've got it together, you need to get it together. It's the way we counsel people when they screw up. Well, just come on, snap out of it. I mean, what's the matter with you? And in doing that, we make them feel worse and lower. But when we realize that even though we may have not acted out in the same way as they have, we have all of that stuff in it. We may have not committed adultery, but we have lust in our hearts. And according to God, that makes us no better than that person. Or, you know what, even though I haven't actually killed somebody, I have harbored revenge in my heart, vengeance in my heart. I've harbored grudges in my heart. And before God, that means I'm actually no better than this person. I'm not. I may have not acted out on it, but that acting out on it is not the primary exposure of my problem. It's what's going on in here. Jesus always cuts through the heart, cuts through outer behavior and gets to what's in the heart. Always, always. And exposes us in our most vulnerable places. What if real freedom okay, isn't about reaching goals and sort of climbing the summits, but what if real freedom has more to do with accepting our limitations? Accepting them. What if real freedom has more to do with finally taking off the masks we wear and being honest about our unfixedness? I mean, people may be temporarily inspired when you share your strengths with them, but people feel a lot less alone when you share your weaknesses with them. That's where the power is. The power is, that's the real me too. That's the power of hearing someone just sort of, or watching someone unravel and to go, me too. Getting down in the dirt with them. The way God does with us, curling up on the bathroom floor with us. I see myself, someone said this not long ago, that I see myself most accurately in my weaknesses, not in my strengths. Imagine if the whole world operated like that, if every person in the world operated that way. I mean, this would be a much more gracious place to be because we wouldn't be comparing ourselves and believing ourselves to be better and believing ourselves to be stronger than this person or that person, or you know what, I may not be perfect, but I'm better than him. I'm better than her. I mean, at least I didn't screw up that bad. How could he? How could she? So what if real freedom has more to do with accepting our limitations, finally taking off the masks we wear and being honest about our unfixedness? So a little sneak preview as to what the guys are going to be studying with me on Tuesday nights. 2 sentences for you. Those who are the most free are those who have the least fear telling the truth about themselves. And those who have the least fear telling the truth about themselves are those who know how much God loves them unconditionally. So those who are the most free are those who have the least fear telling the truth about themselves. One of the ways that I'm able to see that I'm freer than I used to be is because although I told the truth about myself before, I tell much more truth about myself now. Because I am more convinced now than ever before that God loves me unconditionally. And the way that I know that is because in the face of my failure, God never left me, ever. He stuck with me. He didn't blink. He didn't bail. Other people blinked and other people bailed, but God didn't. He fulfilled his promise to never leave me or forsake me. And as much as I wanted to believe that promise before, there was still a part of me that thought I could really screw it up bad enough to where God bails. And I really screwed it up bad, and God didn't bail. And because I know that God loves me unconditionally, I'm not as concerned about what you guys think about me. And when I'm less concerned about what you guys think about me, I'm more willing to tell the truth about myself. Because even if I tell the truth about myself and you walk away, I know that God won't walk away. And the only person's acceptance that I ultimately need is his, and I already have it. So those who are the most free are those who have the least fear telling the truth about themselves. And those who have the least fear telling the truth about themselves are those who know how much God loves them unconditionally. That's courage. One of the things we'll talk about on Tuesday nights with the guys is that where do we get the courage to take our masks off? Where do we get the courage, the boldness to tell the truth about ourselves, the fearlessness to be honest? Where do we get that? It comes from believing more and more and more that God loves us unconditionally. Unconditionally. Because when we accept the truth about ourselves, that we are not what we should be and can't get there on our own, then we start learning to trust more and more that nothing else in this inescapably hard life matters as much as our belovedness. That God loves us. And in the end, that realization, that growing awareness, in the end, that leaves us feeling so free and so giddy. I'm not sure what heaven's going to be like, but I definitely believe it'll be a place filled with laughter. Filled with laughter. The laughter of the redeemed. That deep, belly-roaring hilarity of joy like the prodigal son experienced when his father saw him from a long ways off and started running, scooped him up, and said with a boisterous, mirth-filled heart, "I'm so glad you're home." I'm convinced that the less seriously we take ourselves, the more seriously we take God, the less seriously we take ourselves, and the less seriously we take those around us. And the less seriously we take ourselves and the less seriously we take those around us, the more we laugh. One of the greatest demonstrations of a heart that gets grace is laughter. Laughter. A happy place. I saw a quote this morning. Let me find it. I put it somewhere, but it really speaks to this, and I love it. Let's see, where is it? Hold on. Here it is. Church should be so full of laughter and joy that outsiders press their noses against our windows longing to get into the party. So good, so true. I mean, what would it do for the world around us? What would it do for the people around us if our lives were marked with less seriousness about ourselves and more laughter? I mean, my grandmother, Tete, used to say, laughing at yourself is such a joy. Accepting your own limitations, acknowledging your own weaknesses, recognizing that you're not God, never will be, never have been, that you're gonna screw it up from time to time, you're gonna mess up, you're not gonna do the right thing in the right way. And because God loves you, it's okay. And then when the people around you let you down, you're not devastated the way I was when my parents got divorced. You're like, you know what? They're human too. They understand the pressures of life. They feel it like I do. They feel the temptations in the same way that I feel the temptations. They're insecure in ways that like I'm insecure. That this is us. This is humanity. This is who we are. We are far worse than we think we are. But the good news is that God's grace is infinitely greater than anything we could ever ask for or imagine, and that's what matters most. It's not our goodness or our accomplished goals that matter most. It's the fact that God loves us in our unfixedness, and he delights in us because of what Jesus has done for us. He promises to never leave us, to never forsake us, that he doesn't love us more when we're good, whatever that means, and he doesn't love us less when we're bad. That's what grace is. Grace is unconditional acceptance given to an undeserving person by an unobligated giver. That's what it is. We don't deserve any of this. It's given to us as a gift. How can you not live with a hilarity of joy in light of that? Robert Capon, my hero, says it best, I think, when he says this: grace is the celebration of life, relentlessly hounding all the non-celebrants in the world. Grace needs to make its way into a lot more churches, because there are a lot of people in a lot of churches that would hear what I'm saying now and be like, but don't you take God seriously? Living holy lives? I'm like, yeah, I don't think you take God seriously, because if you took God seriously, then you would know that perfection is the requirement, and that you have fallen short, and that however half-assed you may be moving toward holiness, it's not cutting it. It's not making the grade. God's not impressed. He's not impressed, so stop trying to impress him with all your pious language and all your pious this, that, and the other. Stop trying. God's not impressed. You may impress the person next to you. You may impress your neighbor with it. Wow, what a holy man. What a righteous man. What a good man. God's not impressed. Not impressed. And the burden is the attempt to even try to impress him. What a burden. Impressing God with our righteousness that is as filthy as dirty rags makes no sense. It actually robs life from us. So Capon says, grace is the celebration of life, relentlessly hounding all the non-celebrants in the world. It is a floating, I love this, it is a floating cosmic bash, shouting its way through the streets of the universe, flinging the sweetness of its cassations to every window, pounding at every door in a hilarity beyond all liking until the prodigals come out at last and dance and the elder brothers finally take their fingers out of their ears. It doesn't get any better than that. I've told you, I've shared with you how my professor in seminary said, if you want to make people mad, he had a very thick Southern accent, but he said, if you want to make people mad, fellas, preach the law. If you want to make people really, really mad, preach grace. Because the only thing that offends us more than being told what to do is being told that there's nothing we can do, that it's already been done. Ever since the Garden of Eden, we've wanted skin in the game. We want credit. We clamor for it. We want to believe that we're strong, that we're good. We want to believe we're God, even though we may never say it. That's what the whole thing, it wasn't about the apple or the orange or whatever they ate. That wasn't what it was about. It was the fact that the devil, in tempting Adam and Eve, said, the reason God doesn't want you to eat from this tree is because when you do, you will be like him. And that was just too much of a temptation to pass up. I can be like God. Why be dependent when I can be autonomous? Why be dependent when I can be independent? Why have to depend on God when I can be my own God? And we've been struggling with that ever since. Ever since. In little ways, big ways. I mean, world history is a testimony to the fact that we've been trying to be God. And it's not working. So the goal or the message, the primary message of Christianity is not become like Jesus, okay? It's not. Good luck with that, by the way. I've said before that my life doesn't look like Jesus. My life looks like someone who needs Jesus. And I actually think that glorifies God more because it shows that I'm utterly dependent on him. And so the message of Christianity is not be like Jesus. The message of Christianity is Jesus became like you. That's the incarnation. God, the second person of the Trinity, took on human flesh and frailties and became like you, became like me. He became like us so that we could be accepted forever and ever. And when we take the Lord's Supper together, as we do here at the sanctuary, that's what we're celebrating. We're acknowledging our need. There may be no better demonstration in all of church practice, apart from infant baptism, which is probably the best. But beyond that, there's probably no better demonstration of our neediness and God's provision than when we gather together around this meal. And when we celebrate together the fact that God has done for us what we could never do for ourselves. What we're celebrating when we come forward is that God is God and we are not. And we have big problems and God came with the only solution. That we are sinful and needy and weak and we fall far short of his standard. But he did something about it. The lawmaker became the law keeper and died for us lawbreakers. And that's what we celebrate. When we come forward, we celebrate the goodness of God, the grace of God, the mercy of God, the gift of God to us.